Hi, I'm Kenny Burdine, Associate Extension Professor of Livestock Economics in the University of Kentucky Department of Agricultural Economics. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about accessing and understanding basic cattle market reports. This video is part of our Beef Business Foundation series that is targeted towards new beef producers. This video series is funded by the Kentucky Agricultural Development Fund through the Kentucky Beef Network. Again, in this video I'm going to answer just a couple of simple questions. Number one, how can I access basic market information? And two, how can I make sense of the information that I'm seeing? Understand, first of all, we're fortunate in the U.S. that the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service really does a good job of making sure we have access to price data for cattle. We're also blessed in Kentucky that we have a lot of good market reporters that are watching cattle sell in the yards, and they're getting the information in a form that we can work with. So we do have access to pretty good market data for most all of our auction yards in Kentucky. What I'm going to do now is take a quick sidebar, and I'm going to show you a place that I tend to access market information for auction yards across the state. Now, there's lots of ways to access market information. I'm going to show you one way that I like to use that I think is fairly simple and minimizes the number of clicks that I've got to go through to find reports for a local auction yard in my area. I'm starting from the Kentucky Department of Agriculture's main website, www.kyagr.com. To access market information, I'm going to just simply hover over animal. I'm not clicking, I'm just hovering, and I'm going to slide down to market news. When I do this, it's going to bring up a page that has Kentucky's auction yards listed, and they're sorted by day of the week. I've got Monday reports, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and a couple on Saturday. Now, I happen to be recording this from our department in Lexington, so I'm going to click on the Bluegrass Stock Yards Lexington cattle sale from Tuesday. Again, this report came out, in this case, 2 days ago on Tuesday, and notice there was a correction to the report released on Wednesday where they added a few dairy cattle. Now, you can find one of these for the vast majority of auction markets in Kentucky, but they're all going to look about the same. So at the very top of the report, what you're going to see is a simple breakdown of receipts. So basically, cattle that were sold this week, last week, and last year, same market, based on category. So the majority are going to be feeder cattle, which makes sense in Kentucky. You're going to see some slaughter cattle. Since Kentucky doesn't have a cattle finishing and fed cattle market, these are going to typically be cull cows and pound bulls. And the replacement cattle are going to be things like bred heifers, cow-calf pairs, mature cows, things like that. Immediately under that, you'll see some text that'll just describe basic trends. How did cattle sales compare this week to the same sale last week? There's one of these reports that comes out for the entire state of Kentucky on Monday afternoons, and I always like to read that just to get a feel for what did the market reporters say was changing this week versus last week. Following that, you'll see some reporting where they're reporting cattle that were sold in groups of 20 head or more. Generally speaking, the larger the number of cattle that are sold in one group at one time, the higher the price is going to be. So I like the way this report breaks out those cattle sales that were sold in groups of 20 or more. Not all reports will do that, but I do like it, and that was one reason why I wanted to show this one as kind of my example. Beyond that, we get into the main reporting section where all the cattle sales are reported. Notice I'm under the basic heading here, feeder cattle. And these are going to be grouped by frame size and muscling score as estimated by the graders. So feeder cattle are grouped into small, medium, and large frame sizes. And again, this is based on what the expected finished weight of those cattle would be when they reach their physiological maturity. Muscling scores run 1, 2, 3, and 4, with 1s and 2s being the highest muscling category, heaviest muscled. So the majority of cattle that get sold tend to fall in this medium and large frame, number 1, 2 muscling score category. For that reason, this is the one that I tend to track. So if you've seen me present things and show charts, or if you've read some of my articles, oftentimes what I'll show is price charts for medium and large frame number 1 and 2 steers. Just kind of an illustration here. The weight ranges are generally broken out in 50-pound increments. So for example, right now what I'm looking at is this is the 650 to 700 pound weight range. Notice at the auction facility this week, The low weight in this range was 677, the high was 685, and the average was 678. I've got a range reported for prices there in dollars per hundredweight, and I can see for those cattle in that weight range and that average price, the average price was $151.62 per hundredweight, or about $1.52 per pound. The other thing that you can see is you see some descriptors out by some of these groupings. This is the market reporter's way of communicating something to us. Usually when you see the word value added, the market reporter is trying to signal that these cattle were not green calves. They had been weaned and been through some sort of health program. So, as you can see here, you'll see their prices tend to be a little bit higher than cattle that don't have a description. If I scroll just a little bit further, there in some of the heavier weight categories, I see another descriptor. Okay, notice you see the word fancy there. Again, that's the market reporter's way of signaling something. What they're saying is, these were good quality cattle. They brought a little bit more maybe than some of the other cattle, and we wanted to pull them out and report them separately. And there's definitely value in that. Sometimes you'll see words like thin or fancy or thin or fleshy. And again, that's the market reporter's way of signaling something. If you see fleshy, that means those cattle were carrying more flesh than expected or should have been. And oftentimes the price is a little bit lower. If you see the word thin, that's the market reporter's way of saying those cattle were carrying less flesh than they probably should have. Sometimes those cattle actually do pretty well on a price basis because whoever buys them knows that they're going to gain pretty darn efficiently once they get them on feed and start growing. If I keep scrolling, I can see more steer categories. Here's medium and large frame but lighter muscle steers, and there's more beyond that. I can see dairy steers. After the steers, I get into my heifer category. So here's my medium and large frame, number 1 and 2 heifers. I can kind of keep scrolling through my heifers. Here's my bulls. Eventually I get into the next major grouping. This is slaughter cattle. Again, we sell very few actual finished slaughter steers in Kentucky, so most of this is going to be cull cows, and you start to see pound bulls below that. And then finally I get into replacement cattle. That's where I see bred cows, cow-calf pairs, and possibly bred heifers. So again, you can access a market report like this for virtually every auction yard in the state, and it's an excellent way to understand what cattle are worth in your area. Now that we've looked at some market reports for auction yards in Kentucky, I want to take a few minutes and talk about the futures market. I think it's important that all producers understand what the futures market is and what it means for them in terms of price information. First of all, know what feeder cattle futures prices are. There are 2 feeder cattle contracts that apply to cattle. One is called live cattle futures, and those are finished cattle, fed cattle. We're not going to talk about that in this video. The other is feeder cattle. Understand what those are. Those are medium and large frame number 1 and 2 steers, the same category that I talked about earlier. They're in the Kentucky auction markets, with an average weight of 800 pounds. So when you see a feeder cattle futures price, understand that it's an 800-pound medium and large frame number 1-2 steer. You also want to understand the where. Where are those futures prices most indicative of? Futures contracts are cash settled on the last Thursday of the month based on the CME Feeder Cattle Index. The CME Feeder Cattle Index is a weighted average, a 7-day weighted average of actual feeder cattle prices that fall in that same medium and large frame number 1-2 steer category in 12 states. The map that I'm showing you now shows you the 12 states that are included in that CME index. Notice it spans from the southern plains up to the northern plains and kind of through the Corn Belt. 12 pretty major cattle producing states. So first of all, understand that when you see a futures price, know that we're talking about cattle in that area. And also know that because of transportation cost, Kentucky prices tend to be a little bit lower than prices in those 12 states, and hence the futures market, due to those transportation costs. Now, the next thing I want to do is actually bring up the CME feeder cattle futures prices and talk about how I can access those and what they might mean for me as a beef producer. There's lots of different ways to access feeder cattle futures prices. I'm going to go straight to the source. I'm at the CME's main website. This is www.cmegroup.com. Now, to access quotes, I'm going to go to markets and click on markets. Here I'm going to slide down and click on agriculture. It's going to bring up the main quotes page for me. I can kind of slide down here and keep scrolling. I can get to what I want. It's going to start by showing me some prices for grains. Notice I've got corn, wheat. I can find soybeans there as well. Here's my oil seeds. I go to livestock. I can click here to access live cattle futures, or here in our case to access feeder cattle futures. It's going to bring up the actual quotes for today, right now, for the feeder cattle futures market. Now, I could talk a lot about futures market for many different things. I could talk about price risk management. I could talk about what all these columns mean. But what I really want to focus on here for the next minute or so is just what do the actual prices mean. So we're going to focus on this last column, this last category, which you can think of as kind of being the current price, if you will, for feeder cattle futures. I've got April futures on the board at 158.40. I've got August on the board at 176.30. The first thing I like to say to people is when you see futures prices, look for basic trends. And again, right now, the futures market is suggesting that we may see as much as an $18 per hundredweight or 18 cents a pound increase in the price of these heavy feeder steers out west between April and August. That's valuable information. If I'm going to be selling cattle between now and August, I definitely want to know that the futures market is suggesting that the value of those cattle is going to go up quite a bit between now and when I sell. Secondly, it helps for me to have some sort of idea of how the cattle that I sell might compare to the futures price. Generally speaking, people that sell cattle have a feel for the kind of cattle that they sell, what they weigh, how many they sell at a time, and what the quality is. So I tell people to kind of start keeping track of how your cattle compare price-wise to the futures price. If you learn that over time your cattle typically sell for about $10 back of the futures market, and you've got cattle to sell in August, you can look at that futures price of 176 and say, okay, that probably gives me a price forecast for August for my cattle around 166. So again, think about futures for what it means. A, it provides information about price direction. And B, if I think about basis on how my cattle might actually sell compared to futures, I can actually get a price forecast from the futures based on what I see. Lastly, I want to make you one more resource that I'm involved with that I'd like you to be aware of. Every week, I partner with two of my friends and colleagues, Dr. Josh Maples at Mississippi State University and Dr. James Mitchell at the University of Arkansas, and we in rotation put out Cattle Market Notes Weekly. On Monday afternoons, if you sign up for Cattle Market Notes Weekly, you'll get an email from us that will include usually 3 to 6 paragraphs of market analysis. It'll include some charts based on what we're talking about, cattle price charts, harvest charts, things like that. It'll include a table with prices for Kentucky, Mississippi, Arkansas, and several other states, and it'll include a price chart for futures for live cattle, feeder cattle, and corn, and it'll include the most recent drought monitor. I like to mention this because it's a nice, easy way to keep track of what markets are doing. The other thing I like to say, because the three of us are in the Southeast and are in pretty heavy cow-calf and feeder cattle areas, Cattle Market Notes tends to be a little bit more cow-calf and feeder cattle oriented than a lot of the other market series that are out there. So if you'd like to receive on Monday afternoons Cattle Market Notes Weekly, I would encourage you to click on the link in the comments below and sign up, and we'll see that you get that every Monday afternoon.